Hello and welcome back to the final lecture in this unit and in this class. My name is Matthew Belzer, I'm your instructor, and today we're going to be going over the female reproductive system. The assumption is you've watched the previous video, you have a good idea of what sexual differentiation means, and we're going to springboard off of some of that, and we're going to have a discussion about some of that in today's lecture, and then we're going to expand on our knowledge base, and we're going to talk about the female reproductive anatomy and the female reproductive physiology. As always, I've provided you with a set of learning objectives. You can see them right there. Live them, love them. And I've also given you a handout. So for anybody who's in my class, you know at the beginning you should always print that handout out or have it up and available so you can take notes on it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get going. When we talk about female reproductive organs, right, most of them exist within the pelvic cavity, and the first one we're going to focus on today are the gonads. The gonads in women are the ovaries, and remember they're homologs of the testes or vice versa, meaning they develop from the same tissue embryologically. Now, the job of the ovaries is to carry out what's called oogenesis, which is the production of ovum or egg, which takes place a little bit differently than spermatogenesis. So this is where female gametes, or ovum or egg, are being produced, and the process is a little bit different than the one that you see in spermatogenesis. Then we have the internal female reproductive organs, the vaginal canal, uterus, and uterine duct / fallopian tube, right? Two different ways of saying the exact same thing. On the exam, I'll probably use fallopian tube to pay homage to the scientists who first characterized that structure. Finally, we have our external reproductive organs. Collectively, the external reproductive organs are kind of, when you use the term or when the term vulva is used, you're talking about all the external female reproductive organs, which include like the clitoris, the labia minora, labia majora, and the associated structures. Now, when we are looking at female reproductive anatomy, I want you to have a frame of reference for what I'm about to start talking about, because we're going to jump in and we're going to talk about the gonads or the ovaries first. Then we're going to tie it all together. So within the pelvic cavity, if you take a frontal section of the pelvic cavity and you look from posterior to anterior, that's how we're looking at this here. Right? Within the pelvic cavity, you have the internal reproductive organs. So here's the vaginal canal, here's the uterus, here are the fallopian tubes, they come to the tips here at the fimbria, and then you have your ovaries. Now these structures need to be supported internally. So support structures include the broad ligament. The broad ligament kind of locks the uterus, the superior portions of the vaginal canal, and portions of the fallopian tube into place and prevents them from wiggling around within the pelvic cavity. And the broad ligament is continuous with this external layer on the uterus that we're going to talk about when we talk about the uterus specifically. The ovarian ligament locks the ovary into place, and the suspensory ligament stabilizes the position of the fallopian tube. So know those particular structures, those support structures, and what we're going to focus on first today are the ovaries. So in order to talk about the ovaries, we have to distinguish the process of spermatogenesis and oogenesis. Now, we talked about spermatogenesis in a very brief way, and knowing the process of meiosis, if you understand meiosis, you essentially understand spermatogenesis. So you get the doubling of the DNA and the production of the sister chromatids. That's when a spermatogonium or a germ cell becomes a primary spermatocyte. You have meiosis 1, which the reduction division produces 2 haploid cells, and then meiosis 2, right? At the end of meiosis 2, you're going to have 4 cells from the original spermatogonium, and those sperm are going to enter into the pathway that ultimately leads to ejaculation. With every ejaculation, a male will ejaculate within their semen. So semen, remember, is like 99% glandular secretion, about 1% sperm. But even though it's only 1% sperm, with every ejaculation, there's anywhere from 200 million to 500 million sperm that are released. That is a huge number. That is a gigantic number of sperm that are actually released with every ejaculation. And this is occurring all the time. All day, every day. We just have spermatogenesis taking place, produce large amounts of sperm, and every ejaculation, 200 to 500 million sperm. That dramatically increases, right, the reproductive capabilities of males because they produce so many bloody gametes. Females, on the other hand, oogenesis takes place a little bit differently. Oogenesis is the production of an ovum or an egg. But with oogenesis, you can kind of think of it in a mature, reproductively viable female as taking place over the course of like a month, right? And the number of potential ovum or egg, like mature cells, reduces to one from each ovary during ovulation. Not 200 million or 500 million, one. And through the process of oogenesis, right, it's kind of like meiosis, but the meiotic cycle freezes right here. And essentially, the end product are these things called polar bodies, right, which are just cells that undergo atresia. And then at the end of the line with oogenesis, you get one cell, not 200 million, one cell that's reproductively viable that will be released during the process of ovulation, right? So it's a little bit different in women than it is in men. And women, frankly, have to expend more metabolic energy, right, to carry out the process of gamete formation, which is one of those evolutionary ideas that females as species tend to be more selective because they're more metabolically vested, or it requires more metabolic energy for them to carry out the process of reproduction. So they're going to be more selective about who their mates are because they have to be. So anyway, oogenesis, spermatogenesis, a little bit different. And when we're looking at the process of oogenesis in the female here, and we're looking at what's going on during the ovarian cycle, again, this is an intro class. We don't get into it in a huge amount of detail, but you have the developing oocyte, and that developing oocyte is surrounded by cells. Those cells, right, we call granulosa cells. When you're thinking about the granulosa cells, the thecal cells, and the developing egg, we refer to this entire structure as being a follicle, right? So we refer to this entire structure as being a follicle, the developing ovum and the surrounding cells. We're just going to call it a follicle. Again, I know that this is a really brief overview. It doesn't matter. Just kind of keep that in mind as we go through this next image. So we have our ovarian structure. Here we're looking at a frontal section of the ovaries. The ovary, like many organs, can be broken into the ovarian medulla and the ovarian cortex. And it's within the ovarian cortex that the ovarian cycle, with respect to what we care about from a reproductive standpoint, is taking place. And remember, this takes place over the course of about 28 to 30 days, what I'm about to talk about. But the ovarian cycle is unique from the uterine cycle, and we're going to talk about how the two are linked, but I just kind of want to highlight the anatomy of the ovary and just a little bit about the physiology. So primordial follicles have these guys in them called germ cells or oogonium, and through a series of processes, primordial follicles respond to a hormone released by the anterior pituitary gland called follicle stimulating hormone, and they mature into primary follicles. So you have the cells surrounding the ovum. Primary follicles mature into secondary follicles, the cells surrounding the developing ovum or egg or oocyte. And then these cells split to form eventually what we're going to call a mature follicle. Ignore antral follicle and we'll just focus on mature follicle. When those cells split, those granulosa cells, you get a fluid-filled cavity filled with what's called follicular fluid. You have the developing ovum or egg, and then you have these granulosa cells surrounding that developing ovum or egg. And all of that within the ovary is collectively referred to as being what's called the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. Essentially, you have the maturation of the follicle and the corresponding events taking place in the developing oocyte, which are essentially the events of meiosis, right? Now, when the follicle becomes mature and this follicular fluid is starting to build up pressure and it's putting that pressure against the ovarian wall, that primes it for the next process in the cycle that we care about. And this next process is called ovulation. So the second phase of the ovarian cycle involves a big burst of luteinizing hormone, and luteinizing hormone triggers these cells to crank out more follicular fluid, which puts pressure against the ovarian wall, and essentially the ovarian wall ruptures. And when the ovarian wall ruptures to expel an egg, we refer to this as being ovulation. So here we have our secondary oocyte, which is a mature ovum or egg that's ready for fertilization. And the remaining granulosa cells that latch on or cling on to this as it's expelled, those are called the cells of the corona radiata. The remaining cells of the ruptured follicle form something called the corpus hemorrhagiosum because essentially you've had a break open here or a hemorrhage here, and it's the hemorrhaging body. Now, this process is called ovulation, and after ovulation occurs, ideally that egg gets swept up by the fimbria at the tip of the fallopian tube and it gets drawn into the fallopian tube where ultimately fertilization is going to take place if we have a reproductive event occurring, right? So sometimes the hemorrhaged material from ovulation doesn't actually make it into the fallopian tube. It actually just kind of drops into the abdominal cavity or the pelvic cavity, and it just sits there and eventually gets reabsorbed by the tissue, and it can cause a type of abdominal pain called Mittelschmerz pain, just as a point of interest. After ovulation, the cells of the corpus hemorrhagiosum kind of fuse together and they form another thing called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum, or the yellow body, is responsible for producing progesterone, and that corpus luteum will stick around for a little while and it'll keep cranking out progesterone, which we're going to talk about in more detail in a little bit. So this phase of the ovarian cycle is referred to as the luteal phase, where you have this yellow body or corpus luteum cranking out progesterone. If no implantation occurs, meaning no reproductive event occurs, eventually the corpus luteum degenerates to form a chunk of scar tissue called the corpus albicans. And those are the three phases of the ovarian cycle in a very, very kind of truncated or shortened version because, again, this is an intro class and we're just doing kind of a survey because we go over all 11 organ systems for those of you A&P instructors out there who are getting mad at the things that I'm omitting. I'm simplifying this to the things that are part of the common course objectives for this class. So we have the follicular phase, ovulation, and the luteal phase, right? And those are the three phases of the ovarian cycle. So we're going to come back to that and we're going to talk about the link between the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the ovaries, and the uterus, and how there's a hierarchy of control within the female reproductive cycle. Now, when you're identifying follicles for the anatomy portion of the exam, when we're looking at follicles, these small follicles here with a single layer of cells surrounding them are called primordial follicles. Primordial follicles will mature in response to the presence of follicle stimulating hormone to form what are called primary follicles. So in a primary follicle, you can actually see the ovum or egg and you can look at the chromosomes within because you can actually see the process of meiosis taking place, right? And remember, meiosis involves 2 cycles of cell division, not just 1. So it's a little bit different than mitosis if you recall back from that section of the class. And so you can see the chromosomes here, but here's the developing oocyte or egg or ovum, and this would be called the primary oocyte, right? With the primary follicle, you can distinguish a primary follicle because it has a single layer of cells surrounding the developing ovum or egg. So think about that on your handout. Primary follicle as opposed to secondary follicle. Secondary follicles have a layer of cells surrounding them called granulosa cells. And you can see the developing ovum or egg. In fact, it's in a stage of the meiotic division cycles right there. So secondary follicles, we'd have a secondary oocyte within them. Not a major focal point. Being able to identify the follicles is important. If there are 2 layers of cells surrounding the developing ovum or egg, then you're going to have, and I ask you identify the structure indicated by the bracket, then we are talking about a secondary follicle. And again, these follicles and the eggs within mature in response to a hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. Now, as those cells, those granulosa cells divide and the follicle matures, you're going to get a split in those cells that's going to form an antrum or a cavity. When you see the split in the cells and this antrum or this cavity that's filled with a type of fluid called follicular fluid, then we have what's called a mature follicle. And this mature follicle is primed for ovulation, right? It's ready. It's getting to the point at which ovulation is going to occur. And again, there are a lot of different structures that are indicated on this. For an exam, I'm just going to say identify the structure indicated by the bracket. We have primordial follicles, primary follicle, secondary follicle, mature follicle. And the mature follicle is just getting primed for ovulation to occur, the rupturing of the ovarian wall and the expulsion of the mature ovum or egg, right? So that's the extent to which you kind of need to know that. Now, we have our three phases. We have the follicular phase, ovulation, and then the luteal phase. And if no implantation occurs, that corpus luteum becomes a chunk of scar tissue called the corpus albicans. As a person gets older, right, the more reproductive cycles they've had, the more ovarian cycles they've had, the more scar tissue begins to build up in the ovaries, which can have functional consequences on the ovaries over a prolonged period of time. Now, with respect to the follicular phase, be able to distinguish a primordial follicle from a primary follicle from a secondary follicle from a mature follicle, and be able to tell me what mature follicles are primed for. They are primed for ovulation to occur, right? Now, when we're looking at the internal reproductive anatomy, we've just looked at the ovary in a tremendous amount of detail. Now we are going to look at the rest of the reproductive anatomy, and I'm going to highlight some of the more important structures for you to know. So here we have the vagina. The vagina is a muscular tube that extends up to the uterus. Some textbooks will refer to this as the vaginal canal. Others will just refer to it as the vagina. But the vagina is a muscular tube that extends internally into the body, right? From a reproductive standpoint, the vagina functions kind of as a receptacle for semen, meaning that semen gets ejaculated into the vagina, and that's where sperms start their trip through the female reproductive tract for fertilization to occur. It's also a very important part of the birth canal. So those are the two functional roles of the vagina or vaginal canal I want you to know. Then this pear-shaped organ right here, which sits in the pelvic cavity, is called the uterus. The uterus is very important, and we're going to talk about the different parts of the uterus, the different layers of the uterine wall, before we draw a focus to the endometrium, which is a layer of the uterine wall. So the regions of the uterus I want you to know. The tip of the uterus, right? So the tip of the uterus is a region called the cervix. So if I was to put a box around this area right here and say identify the specific region of the structure indicated, right, we would have the cervix. The major portion of the uterus here is called the body of the uterus, and then the dome-shaped top of the uterus is called the fundus of the uterus. So we're going to start by highlighting the function of the cervix, then we're going to talk about the body of the uterus, then we're going to talk about the fundus of the uterus. So we have the three different regions, and what we're going to do is we're going to start inferior and we're going to work our way superior. Now, when we look at the uterine wall is broken into three layers. So the uterine wall is broken into the endometrial layer. The endometrial layer is the layer of the uterus that periodically builds up and sloughs off during menstruation, and it's actually where implantation takes place. So if we have a fertilized, if an egg is fertilized and it develops into this bundle of cells, that bundle of cells will implant here, and that's ultimately where embryonic and fetal development is going to take place. And oftentimes we refer to this cavity within the body of the uterine cavity, as being the womb, because that's where the development of the embryo and the fetus during gestation is going to take place. So this endometrium is a really important layer, and in fact, when we talk about the female reproductive cycle and we tie everything together, we're going to focus on the endometrium. The myometrium of the uterus is the muscular wall of the uterus. And this muscular wall of the uterus is composed of smooth muscle tissue, and that smooth muscle tissue periodically contracts. So during menstruation, the smooth muscle tissue in the myometrium will contract in order to expel the endometrial tissue, and that's what produces the physical phenomenon of cramps during menstruation. It's actually the pain caused by the contraction of smooth muscle. Smooth muscle contraction can cause pain, internal pain. And it's also very important during Childbirth, the uterine wall starts to contract, and that's what actually produces the force that pushes the baby through the reproductive tract, right? So the myometrium is really important. Finally, the outermost layer that's continuous with the broad ligament out here is called the parametrium, right? The parametrium protects the external region, stabilizes the tissue of the organ, and is essentially continuous, right, with the broad ligament. So it forms a network of connective tissue that stabilizes the position of the uterus within the pelvic cavity. If I ask for endometrium, myometrium, or parametrium, I'm going to ask for the specific layer indicated by the pointer. Now, the different regions of the uterus, right, are the cervix. The cervix is the tip of the uterus, and it has an opening through which, if reproduction is going to occur, sperm actually physically swim through this opening. This opening in the cervix is called the external cervical os, OS. So we have the external cervical os and the internal cervical os, which are two openings through which sperm swim on their way to fertilize an ovum or an egg. Now, when there's a period within the month in which the cervix is producing mucus, and it essentially creates a kind of a plug, a mucus plug in this external cervical os. So some women who take a natural route to birth control will do things like measure body temperature, and they'll feel the thickness of the cervical mucus. When that cervical mucus starts to thin out, it's probably closer to the time when somebody has their reproductive window opening. So there's the cervix. The opening here is the external cervical os. That will be a focal point because that's the structure through which sperm swims. So when you think about barrier methods of contraception, like a diaphragm, a female diaphragm, what they're doing is they're covering up the external cervical os. They don't protect against STDs, but they can prevent their barrier methods of contraception. They can prevent the movement of sperm through that opening. Then we have the uterine cavity. We talked about that briefly, but this is kind of what we consider to be the womb because this is where implantation occurs along the endometrial lining and where an embryo and a fetus will ultimately develop and it'll grow into that uterus. And then we have the fundus of the uterus, which is the dome-shaped top. The fundus is really important from a clinical perspective because when a woman is giving birth, sometimes they give birth to the baby and then afterward they don't pass the placenta, and they need to pass the placenta. It's a large structure and it can't just sit up there and rot and produce infection, so it's got to be passed during childbirth. And one of the procedures that's performed is what's called fundal massage. Now, I've seen fundal massage performed. I thought it would be a massage. It's more like a punch in the stomach with a grinding motion at the end, meaning that you have to put a lot of force on that fundus in order to stimulate the contractions in the myometrium to pass that. So you have the uterus. Those are the structures you need to know. Then you have the fallopian tube. You don't have to know the different regions of the fallopian tube, but you do have to know the structures at the end of the fallopian tube. And the structures at the end of the fallopian tube are called fimbriae, right? Plurally, or fimbria singular. These fimbriae essentially sweep the ovary, and when ovulation occurs, there's spikes in hormones that activate these fimbriae, and they start sweeping the ovary, and they essentially sweep up the egg into the fallopian tube, which is where fertilization actually takes place. So when a sperm fuses with an egg, that's where fertilization takes place. So know those structures. Now, the broad ligament is really important, and one of the conditions that can be associated with problems with the broad ligament or those connective tissue networks is called uterine prolapse. Uterine prolapse is when the uterus is actually physically pushed out of the vaginal canal. So in older patients, uterine prolapse is really common in women who've had multiple children because those ligaments get overstretched during the different cycles of childbirth. and they weaken a little bit. So it's common for older women to have uterine prolapse, and then if they sneeze or they produce pressure in the cavity by using the bathroom or something, they can actually force the uterus out of the vaginal canal and it prolapses. So what we're looking at here is the uterus, and this would be the external cervical os through which sperm swims. In older women, that's corrected surgically, and they sometimes use bands to lock that uterus back in place so that can't continue to happen. You see this a lot in like elder care. With an infant, uterine prolapse can take place, and uterine prolapse can happen in different scenarios. But when I was working in a neonatal intensive care unit, when you saw uterine prolapse in the infant, oftentimes the doctor would want to get a genetic test done specifically for connective tissue disorders, because weakening of the connective tissue or an inability to produce collagen with a disease like osteogenia imperfecta, where collagen production is influenced, can weaken those ligaments, and it can produce a condition in which the baby may have a uterine prolapse. So that warrants something like a genetic test. You want to figure out what's going on, because that shouldn't happen in somebody so young unless there's some kind of predisposing factor. So we have the uterus, uterine prolapse, and then we have the fallopian tubes. Histologically, the fallopian tubes are surrounded by smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle gets activated and it contracts to help propel things like the ovum or the egg. Then lining the uterus, we have this epithelial tissue, and the uterus, or lining the fallopian tube, we have this epithelial tissue, and within the fallopian tube, so we have this smooth muscle tissue, and then we have this epithelial tissue. Pardon me if I said uterus. I'm not going to go back and correct it, though, because I don't have enough bloody time, because I'm putting this up in a very short period of time. So lining the fallopian tube, we have these secretory cells. Secretory cells produce fallopian fluid, which is the fluid you actually find in the tube. And then you have these ciliated cells, and the cilia actually rhythmically contract in order to propel the fluid through the fallopian tube. And again, remember that that fluid is sometimes carrying an ovum or an egg, and that's what propels that ovum or that egg through those fallopial networks. So you have the fallopian tube lined by smooth muscle tissue, and then you have regions where you have secretory cells and then ciliated cells, where you see ciliated, non-ciliated, ciliated, non-ciliated. You are definitely looking at the fallopian tubes, a histological image of the fallopian tube. So remember that for the exam, and you can kind of see that again here. So you got ciliated, non-ciliated, ciliated, non-ciliated. And those ciliated cells within the fallopian tube are there to kind of propel the ovum or the egg through the fallopian tube itself. Now, the uterus, when we think about the uterus, one of the most important layers of the uterus is what's called the endometrium. And the endometrium can be broken into two different layers. We have the basal layer, which is a network of essentially stem cells that's always there, actively reproducing cells. It doesn't slough off in the process of menstruation. It's always there. So you have your basal layer down here, but you'll notice then you have your functional layer. Now, the functional layer of the uterine lining, or the endometrium, is the layer that periodically builds up and sloughs off during the process, during the uterine cycle, right? And we're going to talk about the different phases of the uterine cycle in just a moment. So when we're focusing on the uterine cycle, what we're looking at is the endometrium of the uterus, meaning that internal lining of the uterus right here. And in response to the different chemical factors, it periodically builds up and then sloughs off, and then builds up and sloughs off in a cyclical manner that takes place in accordance with the other reproductive events that are taking place that we're going to talk about. So when you're thinking about the endometrium, if I say identify the layer indicated by the bracket, that's the endometrium. If I split it into two sublayers, you have the basal layer of the endometrium that's always there, never sloughs off, and then you have the functional layer that periodically builds up and sloughs off, or, right, functions for implantation and ultimately the initial portions of gestation and development of like an embryo. So that endometrial lining is really, really important with respect to reproduction, and we're going to look at how they all tie together in just a moment. So this particular image is going to be very, very important on your next exam, right? Multiple questions are going to be asked based on this image. And the reason that this image is so good is because it ties together what's happening in the brain, what's happening in the pituitary gland, how the pituitary gland influences the ovaries, and how the ovaries influence the uterus. So there's a hierarchy of control here. You don't think about reproductive cycles as being controlled by the brain, but they're absolutely controlled by the brain. The hypothalamus is the master regulator of both the male and the female reproductive cycle, right? The hypothalamus exerts control over the pituitary glands. The pituitary glands guide the processes in the ovary. So what we're looking at here is the ovarian cycle, and we're looking at that ovarian cortex, if you kind of recognize those different phases that are happening here. And then the ovaries exert influence over the uterus, right? So there's a hierarchy of control here. So you have to understand what's happening in the hypothalamus to understand the pituitary to understand the ovarian cycle to understand the uterine cycle, because there are tiers of control and they all link together. So let's start by talking about the beginning of the ovarian cycle. So we have our days here. Assuming menstruation occurred, the ovarian cycle is offset just a little bit with respect to the uterine cycle, but we're going to try and correlate those events as much as we can. So there's a dramatic drop in progesterone and estrogen. When progesterone and estrogen levels are very low, right? So estrogen and progesterone levels are very low. That's what triggers the start of the ovarian cycle. So progesterone and estrogen levels drop really, really low. You have a decrease in estrogen and progesterone. That signals the hypothalamus to produce gonadotropin-releasing hormone. That gonadotropin-releasing hormone is then released into the blood, where it travels to the anterior pituitary gland, and it says, hey, anterior pituitary gland, we need 2 hormones being produced. The initial hormone is what's called follicle-stimulating hormone. So when you're looking at these blue lines, you're looking at the events that follicle-stimulating hormone triggers. Follicle-stimulating hormone promotes the maturation of follicles. So there are receptors located in these cells, and when they bind to follicle-stimulating hormone, it changes their events metabolically. Primordial follicles mature into primary follicles. Ovum, 1 layer of cells, primary follicles to secondary follicles. When you're looking at it histologically, ovum, 2 layers of cells. Secondary follicles to mature follicles. These mature follicles, which have this antrum filled with follicular fluid, are primed for ovulation. They're ready for ovulation. All of this put together constitutes what's called the follicular phase, right? So you have the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, which we looked at previously, and we looked at the histology that you're going to need to know. Now, luteinizing hormone, if we're continuing to focus on the ovarian cycle, luteinizing hormone, a big spike of luteinizing hormone is what actually triggers the second phase of the ovarian cycle, which is ovulation. So luteinizing hormone spikes in response to a big spike in luteinizing hormone. Pressure builds up against the ovarian wall, and the developing oocyte, or the mature ovum, right, is ejected during the process of ovulation, and presumably this is going to get swept up by the fimbria and sucked into the fallopian tube, right? Then you have this corpus hemorrhagiosum that's left. Now, this corpus hemorrhagiosum, right, those cells clump together and they form what's called the corpus luteum. Luteinizing hormone essentially tells the cells of the corpus luteum, it binds to receptors and it functions like a tropic hormone, right? A tropic hormone being a hormone that tells another gland to release a hormone. And these remaining cells of the corpus luteum produce a ton of progesterone and estrogen. If no implantation occurs, the corpus luteum during the luteal phase degrades to form a chunk of scar tissue called the corpus albicans. There is your ovarian cycle. The hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary controls the ovaries. The ovaries exert influence over the uterus. So down here at the end of this cycle, kind of linking all these different cycles together, you have the uterine, aka the menstrual cycle. So we begin at menstruation. Now, luteinizing hormone tells the granulosa cells in these developing follicles to produce estrogen. Estrogen is a hormonal signaling molecule that does a lot of different things throughout the female body, notably the maintenance of secondary sex characteristics, like where hair deposition occurs, adipose deposition, muscle deposition, right, cardiovascular traits, etc. With respect to reproduction, estrogen released by the granulosa cells in these developing follicles, so luteinizing hormone, tells these cells surrounding the developing egg or oocyte, hey, you got to produce estrogen. Estrogen then travels through the bloodstream to the endometrial lining of the uterus, and it binds to these cells and it causes blood vessels to grow. And the growth and proliferation of these blood vessels, right, kind of correlate with the tacking on of tissue in this area. So the estrogen essentially tells the endometrial lining, and specifically the functional layer, hey, you got to get thicker. While the endometrial lining is getting thicker, we refer to this as being the proliferative phase. So estrogen from the ovaries, from these granulosa cells, tells the functional layer of the endometrium to get thicker. As it's getting thicker, that's called the proliferative phase. Now you get this big spike of luteinizing hormone in ovulation, and notice that ovulation corresponds with when the endometrial lining is getting toward its thickest. So right now, if you're thinking about this period of time, it's about a 7-day period of time, this is what's called a woman's reproductive window. This is when fertilization and implantation can happen during the cycle. This also correlates with things like a drop in basal body temperature, a thinning of the cervical mucus. So there are some women who are particularly attuned to their body rhythms who use apps or just learn how to do a natural form of birth control, which can be effective, but you really have to know your body, right? I tried practicing that natural form of birth control with my significant other, and now I'm a father. So you have the ovulation that takes place here. Now, luteinizing hormone sticks around and it continues to tell these cells in the corpus luteum produce progesterone and estrogen. Progesterone is the one that I'm going to focus on here. Progesterone essentially binds to and keeps these arteries dilated, so blood is feeding into the functional layer. And when progesterone is essentially maintaining the endometrial lining at its thickest, we call this the secretory phase. There's a correlation between the concentration of progesterone in the blood and the thickness of the endometrial lining. Progesterone maintains that thickness in that endometrial lining, and now we are primed for implantation. When that endometrial lining is at its thickest during the secretory phase, maintained predominantly by estrogen, we're ready for implantation to occur. Now, if no implantation occurs, right, eventually the corpus luteum will degrade to form the corpus albicans. You get a dramatic drop in progesterone and estrogen. With no progesterone and estrogen, these blood vessels essentially vasoconstrict. No blood is getting to the endometrial lining in the functional layer, so that endometrial lining dies off and it sloughs off that endometrial tissue in the process of menstruation. So when you look at menstrual flow, right, you see these chunks and things in it because it's not primarily blood, it's primarily endometrial tissue, unless you have some kind of problem like endometriosis, and we're not going to talk about that too much, although it's interesting. So you have menstruation. Hypothalamus controls the pituitary, pituitary controls the ovaries exert influence over the uterus. Now, all of this is controlled hormonally. So when you're thinking about like the follicular phase and the luteal phase, and you could cram in ovulation there, you can actually see body temperature drops during the follicular phase and it changes during the luteal phase. So women who monitor their body temperature to evaluate for ovulation, that's actually rooted in good science. Hormone levels. We have follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So hypothalamus tells pituitary to produce follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone in response to low concentrations of progesterone and estrogen. That's what essentially triggers the entire cycle. At the end of the ovarian cycle, when the corpus luteum degrades to form that chunk of scar tissue, estrogen and progesterone concentrations are at their highest. When the corpus luteum degrades to form the corpus albicans, you get a transition between high levels of progesterone and estrogen, and then once that corpus albicans forms, essentially the levels of estrogen and progesterone drop, and that's what triggers a new reproductive cycle to occur. So when you're looking at this, if we track follicle stimulating hormone, you get relatively high levels of follicle stimulating hormone comparative to their baseline during the follicular phase. Luteinizing hormone is there telling the ovaries to produce estrogen. Spike in luteinizing hormone during ovulation. So what ovulation kits, like kits designed to predict whether you have whether ovulation is occurring, like urine tests, what they're doing is they're measuring the concentration of luteinizing hormone. Spikes in luteinizing hormone are indicators of ovulation. When you get that spike in luteinizing hormone, notice you also get a spike in estrogen because luteinizing hormone tells the granulosa cells to produce estrogen. Now that luteinizing hormone sticks around and it actually tells the cells of the corpus luteum to produce progesterone and estrogen, but predominantly progesterone. So that progesterone, right, is what maintains the thickness of the endometrial lining during the secretory phase by essentially dilating those blood vessels, and that estrogen is also important here. When the luteal phase comes to its end, no implantation occurs, that corpus luteum degrades to the point where it forms the corpus albicans. No more estrogen and progesterone are being produced, and that's what triggers the cycle again. So when you think about contraceptives, you have hormonal contraceptives. Hormonal contraceptives are essentially just estrogen and progesterone, right? That you have combined or just singular, but they're estrogen or progesterone. And you can have them in pill form, you can have them contraceptive injections, creams, implants, intrauterine devices that can be implanted in the uterus that actually produce, are hormonally based. And then you have non-hormonal contraceptive methods. The condom, diaphragm, which latches up over the uterus, intrauterine device like that's copper that essentially irritates the lining of the endometrial lining and prevents implantation from occurring. The natural rhythm methods. Check your body temperature, look at the thickness of the cervical mucus. When body temperature drops and the thickness of the cervical mucus thins, don't have sex during that time. So there are multiple different types of contraception, right? Now, when you're thinking about what actually triggers a new cycle, progesterone and estrogen, luteinizing hormone triggers the release of progesterone and estrogen. Progesterone and estrogen concentrations are high during the secretory phase, particularly progesterone. When the concentration of these hormones drops at the end of the luteal phase, that's what triggers this to happen again. So the hypothalamus detects drops in progesterone and estrogen, tells the anterior pituitary gland, release follicle stimulating hormone. If you take a hormonal contraceptive, right, let's say we're taking a combined pill that has both progesterone and estrogen. Essentially, the elevated levels of progesterone and estrogen, one, maintain the thickness of the endometrial lining. That's why you'll get a sugar pill during, the 28-day period that you're taking pills so you can kind of maintain a healthy menstrual cycle. But two, what the presence of progesterone and estrogen do is they trick the hypothalamus into thinking that we're still in the luteal phase or maybe even that implantation occurred. So elevated levels of progesterone and estrogen essentially inhibit the release of follicle stimulating hormone. No follicle stimulating hormone, no follicle maturation, no ovulation, right? So that's what hormonal contraceptives in women do. They trick the hypothalamus into not restarting the reproductive cycle because the way that the hypothalamus, right, detects that, hey, we need to restart that reproductive cycle is based on the concentrations of progesterone and estrogen. So when you're looking at this reproductive cycle, the plus means that's stimulated and the minuses mean it's inhibited. So in response to low concentrations of estrogen and progesterone, right? Concentrations of estrogen and progesterone drop. Hypothalamus tells anterior pituitary to produce follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle stimulating hormone goes to the ovaries where it triggers the maturation of follicles. Right? Luteinizing hormone goes to the cells in those follicles, the granulosa cells, and says, hey, produce estrogen, right? that luteinizing hormone then sticks around and says, hey, produce progesterone. And when estrogen and progesterone levels are high, this pathway is shut off. So when estrogen and progesterone levels spike, notably during the luteal phase, the hypothalamus goes, okay, we're good, right? Anterior pituitary goes, okay, we're good. So hormonal contraceptives essentially trick the brain into not releasing follicle stimulating hormone, which is necessary for the development of follicles. That's this female HPG axis. What it's actually referring to is the female hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. How does communication take place between these different regions and structures, right? So that's how hormonal contraceptives work. Now, the male reproductive cycle works on a very, very similar basis. And as a consequence of that, the male reproductive, there are male reproductive methods that are using this kind of testosterone mimic, and I won't get into this too deeply, but they've passed the safety phase of clinical trials, meaning they're on the horizon. They're a realistic possibility within the next 5 years that these are going to get FDA approval and go out into the general population. So when you look at the female HPG axis, we just evaluated that in detail. The male HPG axis works relatively similar. So the hypothalamus detects low levels of testosterone. When testosterone levels drop, the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to produce follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Follicle-stimulating hormone triggers spermatogenesis. Luteinizing hormone triggers the production of testosterone. In response to high levels of testosterone, this pathway is inhibited. So men have fluctuations in their hormonal concentrations as well. So if you have a testosterone mimic and you take it like in a cream or as a pill, what that does is it tells the hypothalamus not to produce follicle-stimulating hormone, no follicle-stimulating hormone, no spermatogenesis. The new male reproductive tactics work exactly the same as the female reproductive tactics that have been around for a long time. It's just that women have had to bear the brunt of reproductive burden for a very, very long period of time. So now we're going to look at some more of the anatomy. Here's the vaginal canal. So here's the urinary bladder, and that's the urethra. The vaginal canal is a separate opening. It's not regulated by a sphincter of any kind. So when you have menstruation, you can't really control when it comes out because there's no sphincter preventing the movement of that endometrial tissue out of the vaginal canal. Now, the vaginal canal is a very important structure, notably during childbirth. And during childbirth, especially if you have a complicated childbirth or a problem with your childbirth, right, sometimes you can rip essentially openings during things like childbirth between two canals. So let's say you like ripped an opening between the vaginal canal and the rectum. Those are supposed to be separate. There should never be an opening between those. Or let's say the vaginal canal and the urinary bladder and an opening rips. So an opening where you don't want one, or a canal or a connection where you don't want one, is called a fistula. It's essentially a hole. And fistula can be huge, right? They can be gigantic, and they're really problematic. They need to be surgically corrected because there's all sorts of ways that they form. But when a fistula forms as a consequence of childbirth, it's called an obstetric fistula. And the problem with that is if you have a hole ripped open between like the urinary bladder and the vaginal canal, right, urine can just kind of leak out of the vaginal canal because there's nothing holding it in, and it can produce a steady stream that just leaks down the leg, right? So essentially a weird form of urinary incontinence. If it rips between the rectum and the vaginal canal, you can get fecal matter coming out of the vaginal canal, and it can open this region up for very serious infection. So obstetric fistula is actually a problem, a big problem globally, right? And there's a great documentary about it. The vaginal canal is lined by stratified squamous epithelium, by the way, because it needs to be tough because you don't want it ripping. But there's a great documentary about obstetric fistula and just how big it is, how big of a problem it is, the scope of the problem, called A Walk to Beautiful. So it talks about these women in rural Ethiopia, these very young girls who, when they gave birth, they developed an obstetric fistula, and they were kind of ostracized by their communities, right? They have this constant leak of urine going down their leg, and it smells. It opens them up to infection, and it was socially stigmatizing. So this guy opens up a clinic to fix obstetric fistula, because you can do that surgically, and these women are just coming from all over Ethiopia, and it really gives you an insight into like the scope of the problem. It's a beautiful documentary. Now, we have external female reproductive anatomy that we refer to as being the vulva. So the mons pubis is this kind of fat pad on which pubic hair grows. And then when we look here, we have the labia minora and the labia majora. Then we have the clitoris, and a lot of the clitoris actually extends into the body. The clitoris is a much bigger structure than you think if you actually look at that tissue. And the clitoris is covered by the prepuce, or the clitoral hood, and it has a much higher density of sensory receptors than the penis. If you remember from our discussion of sexual differentiation, the clitoris and the penis are homologs of one another, meaning that they both develop from the genital tubercle during sexual differentiation. So I'm going to give you a warning about this next slide, but I think it's important to talk about. A lot of people in my classes have never heard of a practice that some people refer to as female circumcision. I would never use the term circumcision. I would always use the term female genital mutilation. That's what I call it, right? So I don't like the term circumcision because it whitewashes essentially what's happening here. So with female circumcision, right, which has absolutely no medical benefit, opens women up to infections, makes sex and childbirth excruciatingly painful. Some types of female circumcision, what happens is essentially you take the clitoris and you put a hook through it and you pull it out and you sever it. Now, if we're going to draw analogies here, remember that the clitoris and the penis are homologs of one another. So surgically removing, well, not surgically, just cutting the clitoris off is analogous to cutting the penis off. Not the foreskin of the penis, the entirety of the penis. That's why I don't like the term circumcision being applied to this. If we're going to draw the analogy here, it'd be like cutting the penis off. Then the labia minora and labia majora can be removed, and the vaginal opening is sewn shut until they hit their child-rearing years, and it's only opened back up, during childbirth. What this does is it produces all kinds of problems with menstruation happening properly, and that endometrial tissue can get locked up in that vaginal canal. It can produce septic infections. It makes childbirth and sex very painful. And it's a very, very widely practiced medical, I guess you could say medical procedure. I hate to use that term because there's absolutely no benefit to it whatsoever. And this is where you get into, I have a good friend who works for Women International, and this is where you get into what constitutes a human rights abuse and what constitutes a cultural practice. Where does that line get drawn? And it's difficult, and what she does on this particular campaign is very difficult. So, fertilization. We have sperm. It swims up through the uterine cavity, and that sperm will eventually fuse with a developing ovum or egg, and that happens within the fallopian tube. When sperm fuses with the developing ovum or egg to produce a diploid cell, that initial fertilized cell that now has 46 chromosomes is called a zygote. That zygote then undergoes a series of division to form a ball of cells, and this ball of cells, right, eventually implants in the endometrial lining. Now, one of the things that forms right off the bat is a placenta, right? So the placenta forms, and I've given you a question about this on your sheets. The placenta produces a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. And what HCG does, human chorionic gonadotropin, is it travels to the cells of the corpus luteum and it says, hey, stick around and keep producing progesterone and estrogen because now implantations occurred and we need this endometrial lining thick, right, for gestation and development. So when people take a pregnancy test to evaluate whether they are pregnant, the pregnancy test is going to look for the hormone human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, because it is produced by the placenta. So the only way you're going to have that is if fertilization and implantation have taken place. Now, sometimes men can produce HCG. The production of HCG in men, meaning if men show up positive, if they're taking a pregnancy test and they're like, oh, I'm pregnant, that actually is often a consequence of testicular cancer. So it can be used as a screening tool for testicular cancer. So, when you think about fertilization, what's actually happening here? Well, a sperm is fusing with the egg and then it's injecting its genetic material. Now, we're not going to evaluate fertilization in too much detail, but I do want you to kind of understand the process. So you have multiple sperms swimming around this ovum or egg. First off, notice the size difference between the ovum and egg. Ovum, aka egg, and the sperm, right? And then, if this was AMP2, I would explain why that actually happens with respect to the development of polar bodies, etc. But sperm is much smaller than ovum or egg, and it just injects essentially the genetic material. So before fertilization, you have 23 chromosomes in the ovum or egg, and you have 23 chromosomes in the sperm. The sperm injects the 23 chromosomes, and after fertilization, you have a zygote, and you have what's called a diploid cell, meaning it has the full complement of chromosomes and all the genetic information it needs to carry out those cell divisions that ultimately produce a human. Right? So you can see the sperm fusing there, and it's not just one sperm, right? All of these sperms have hit the egg, so there are multiple sperms that are trying to get in. Now, when you think about it, here we have what's called the corona radiata. These are the remaining granulosa cells that kind of latch on to the ovum or egg during during ovulation, right? So you have these corona cells of the corona radiata. Now, I won't get into the receptor mechanics here. There are a bunch of different receptors involved in this, but essentially the sperm run into the wall of the ovum or the egg, and their acrosomes burst and they spill enzymes, and those enzymes start degrading down the wall of the egg. And a lot of times sperms work synergistically with one another. So they may explode their acrosome and not be the sperm that fertilizes the egg, but they've essentially laid the track for another sperm to fertilize the egg. So when the sperm actually fertilizes the ovum or the egg, notice that the mitochondria don't enter into the ovum, right? The sperm essentially latches onto a receptor in this layer right here called the zona pellucida. And when it latches onto this receptor, it's called it's just a receptor that the sperm latches onto. It injects its genetic material, but notice that the mitochondria stay out here that are associated with the mid piece of the sperm. As a consequence of that, you always inherit mitochondria from the mother. So if you're ever tracking mitochondrial DNA, this ovum down here has mitochondria in it, not this injected genetic material. So you're going to inherit mitochondria from your mom. Whenever you're using mitochondrial DNA, you're tracking maternal lineages, right? Now, so we see kind of what's happening with fertilization here. Now, you don't want what's called polyspermy or polyfertilization. You don't want multiple sperm fertilizing the egg. So the moment that this sperm injects its genetic material into the egg, there's a reaction called the cortical reaction in which the wall of the egg gets hard to prevent multiple sperm from fertilizing it. Now, we don't get into I'm not going to talk about the mechanics of protein cross-linkage during the cortical reaction, but you can actually see this happen. So what you're looking at on this video when it restarts is, here we have a sperm protein. Now, you can't use sperm and ovum in the United States because you can't fertilize an egg for the sake of scientific experimentation, which is what we're doing here. We're using an imaging technique to look at this reaction called the cortical reaction, where you can see the wall of the ovum or the egg harden. So you have the sperm, and specifically a sperm protein that mimics the process of fertilization. But if we look at it from the beginning, sperm protein injected, and then you get that cortical reaction in which the wall of the egg hardens, right? So it prevents multiple sperm from fertilizing the egg. So the moment that one sperm fertilizes the egg, it's almost like a meteor striking the earth. You get a ripple effect that essentially spreads around the entire ovum, and it prevents polyspermy from happening. Now, some of the things you should be aware of is, when you think about in vitro fertilization, essentially you're taking an ovum and an egg and external from the body, you're fertilizing, you're growing them into a bundle of cells, and you're popping them back in the body, and you're hoping that implantation takes place. One of the newer trends that has emerged is what's called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So let's say that you're a carrier of a disease and your significant other is a carrier of a disease. You can actually take the developing essentially bundle of cells at this point called a morula and a blastocyst, and you can pluck cells from them. You can do genetic analysis, and you can go, oh, okay, this particular bundle of cells carries the mutation for muscular dystrophy, so we're definitely not implanting that one. So that's essentially a form of genetic engineering, right? You're preventing negative traits and you're allowing positive traits to pass on to the next generation. And at the moment, that genetic engineering is targeted specifically at, disease, right? Preventing the development of disease. But as we begin to know more about genetics, how do we what gene combinations constitute intelligence or height or whatever it is, right? We can start to select for those traits, and we can actually have a lot of ripple effects downstream on the genetic pool. So implantation is the process by which a developing bundle of cells essentially latches onto the endometrial lining. One of the first structures it forms is the placenta. The placenta produces human chorionic gonadotropin, and that's what tells the corpus luteum, hey, stick around for a bit and keep producing progesterone and estrogen. It's also what we use as a marker of pregnancy. So when you think about sperm flow from beginning to end, sperm is made in the seminiferous tubules. It matures. It's stored and matured in the epididymis, to the vas deferens, to the ejaculatory duct, which runs through the prostate gland, to the prostatic urethra, membranous urethra, spongy urethra, out the tip, right, to the vaginal canal, up through the through the vaginal canal, through the cervical os, into the uterine cavity, and into the fallopian tube where fertilization takes place. That is a long distance for a sperm to travel. Thanks a lot.